The bell in the courthouse tower didn't just ring, it tolled. Like a hammer hitting a coffin nail, the sound rolled over the dusty main street, and every single person stopped what they were doing. They all turned to watch the woman being dragged toward the auction block. Her name was Clara Mayfield. Her wrists were bound raw with thick hemp rope, and her bare feet scraped against the splintered wood of the boardwalk. Her dress was torn, hanging in tatters, but it couldn't hide the swell of her belly. She was heavy with child, and with every jolt, with every shove from the guards, the life inside her shifted. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, darted at her side, clinging to the rags of her mother's skirt. This was Elsie. "Don't take her!" the little girl screamed, her voice splitting the air. "Don't take my mama!" A guard's boot swung out, casual and cruel, and kicked the child away. Elsie hit the dirt with a cry that was pure terror. "She's got the baby!" she shrieked, scrambling back toward her mother. "Please, please, don't hurt her." Some of the men in the crowd just laughed. A few even tipped their hats like this was some kind of Sunday show. The women turned their faces, but their whispers were as sharp as knives. Sin will out. She brought this on herself. In their eyes, Clara wasn't a person. She was a lesson. A scandal to be paraded in the sun for everyone to judge. But Clara didn't weep. Her chin trembled, but she kept it high. She would not let them see her break. Shame stung worse than the rope, worse than the dirt, worse than the jeers. She'd been broken once before, on a night she didn't choose. The mark of that night lived inside her now, pressing against her ribs, kicking, demanding to be born. She carried her disgrace and her only hope in the same fragile body. The auction block loomed ahead, its boards worn grey and smooth by the feet of others who had stood where she was about to stand. One more step, and she would be measured, inspected, and sold like cattle. Elsie scrambled after her, her little hands bloodied from clawing at the dirt. She grabbed the edge of the platform, her voice breaking. "Mama," she sobbed, "don't let them hurt you no more." For the first time, Clara's composure cracked. A sob rose in her throat, not for herself, but for her daughter, forced to watch this. She turned her head, meeting Elsie's wide, wet eyes. The world seemed to slow down. The dust motes hung golden in the air. The crowd became a blur of faceless shapes. Clara forced a smile, a faint, broken thing. But it was for her child. Her lips formed the silent words she always used to soothe her. "Hush, little bird." The auctioneer's whip cracked nearby. It didn't touch her, but the sound alone stung. Clara staggered but caught herself, her shoulders rigid. "Look at her," a man in the crowd jeered. "Swollen as a tick, ought to throw in the brat for free." The laughter that followed was coarse and heartless. Elsie's cries pierced through it again, frantic and high-pitched. "Mama's hurting. The baby's coming. Can't you see? Stop it." She pounded her small, bloody fists against the wood of the platform. Her pleas rattled the air, but no one moved to help. No one even looked at her with pity. "Step lively, girl," the auctioneer barked. He was a red-faced man, sweat trickling down his thick neck. He grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her forward. Her knees threatened to give way, but she climbed that single step with a dignity carved from pure will. The boards groaned under her weight. Elsie slipped past the guards again, pressing herself against the base of the platform, her little body shaking with sobs. Her voice rose again, but this time it was different. It was clear and fierce. "She's my mama. Don't you hurt her no more." Her cry cut sharper than any whip. For a moment, the crowd shifted, uneasy. Her raw grief had touched something they'd tried to bury, but still no one stepped forward. Silence pressed down, heavy and suffocating. And then, from the far edge of the gathering, a figure stirred. He was tall and broad-shouldered, leaning against a hitching post. The brim of his hat cast a deep shadow over his face. His name was Jonas Hart, and he had been standing there since the first toll of the bell. Silent, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the platform. At Elsie's cry, his jaw tightened. His fists, covered in worn leather gloves, clenched until the knuckles were white. The auctioneer raised his voice, shattering the quiet. "We'll start the bidding at $10. His words rang out, sharp and final. The jeers and laughter surged back, the crowd eager for the show to continue. Clara stood there, unbowed, shame burning her throat. Elsie clung to the wood below her, tears spilling down her dirty cheeks. And across the dusty square, Jonas Hart lifted his head. For the first time, his eyes were clear of the shadows. They locked on Clara's. He didn't move. Not yet. But something in the air shifted. Like the feeling right before lightning strikes. The auctioneer's voice cracked over the crowd again. $10, he bellowed, his tone thick with mockery. Who'll give me 10 for this fine mare? Comes with a little one bawling at her skirts and another near ready to drop. 2 for the price of 1, gentlemen. The crowd roared. It was a cruel, ugly sound. Clara stood on the block, the rope biting into her wrists, the sun hammering down on her. Her face was flushed with shame, but her chin was high. Every muscle in her body trembled with the effort not to collapse. Down below, Elsie pressed her small hands against the splintered wood, her eyes searching her mother's face for a miracle. 10, I said, the auctioneer snapped, waving his fleshy arms. Surely one of you bold lads wants a woman who'll birth before the first frost sets in. He leaned forward, grinning at his own vile joke. Why, you can start your own herd, the men hollered. Some whistled. A man near the front, with a sneer on his lips, lifted a hand. 5, he called out. She's barely worth the rope tying her. 5, the auctioneer echoed, his voice dripping with disdain. I asked for 10, but we'll start if we must. 5 it is. Who'll make it 6? Another man shouted, 6 if you throw in the brat? The crowd howled with laughter. Elsie flinched, pressing her cheek against the rough wood as if she could make herself disappear. A sharp pang shot through Clara's belly, so intense it nearly stole her breath. The baby shifted, restless. She bit the inside of her cheek hard, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She lifted her gaze over their heads, fixing her eyes on the empty horizon. 6. Do I hear 7? The auctioneer roared. 7, barked a voice. 8. Followed another, fueled more by cruelty than any real desire. From the shadows at the back of the crowd, Jonas Hart hadn't moved. Arms folded, hat brim low, he just watched. His expression was a mask, but his fists curled tighter and tighter, the leather of his gloves creaking with every new bid. 9. A drunken ranch hand called out, his grin wide and stupid, his eyes crawling over Clara's body with a shameless hunger. $9, and I'll have her crawl all the way home. Elsie's cry rang out again, shrill and piercing. Stop it. Mama's sick. The baby's coming, can't you see? Stop. Her fists pounded the wood until her knuckles were red and raw. Her pleas shook the air, but the laughter just swallowed them whole. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $9, going once. And that's when Jonas moved. He stepped out of the shadows. The crowd parted for him as he walked forward, his height casting a long shadow in the dust. The murmurs died. Every eye was on him. His steps were slow, deliberate, his boots heavy against the hard-packed dirt. He didn't stop until he was near the front. 20, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a razor, clean and sharp. Everyone heard it. The auctioneer faltered, his gavel frozen in mid-air. He blinked, stunned. 20, Jonas repeated, his gaze locked on Clara. It was steady, unflinching, final. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Laughter sputtered out. No one challenged him. There was something in his voice, a quiet steel that warned them all to stay back. 20 it is, the auctioneer finally said, forcing a cheerful tone. Do I hear 21? He scanned the faces. No one moved, no one spoke. Going once, going twice. The gavel slammed down on the wood. The sound was like a gunshot. Sold! Clara swayed on her feet, the word echoing in her bones. Elsie looked up, her tear-streaked face a mask of confusion. Jonas didn't hesitate. He mounted the 2 steps to the platform. He took the dusty coat from her shoulders, only to settle it more firmly around her, covering the torn dress, hiding her from their eyes. Then, without a word, he bent down and lifted Elsie into his arms. The little girl stiffened, startled, but he held her steady and close. Her tiny clenched fists slowly relaxed against his rough shirt. The crowd began to mutter, angry they'd been robbed of the rest of their show. Jonas's gaze swept over them, hard and final. It was a warning. No one dared meet his eyes. Clara just stared at him. She searched his face for the mockery, for the cruelty she expected. She found nothing, only a stillness, deep and unreadable, like a river at night. Elsie pressed her face into his chest, her sobs finally softening into hiccups. The platform creaked as he stepped off it. He had bought her, he had saved her from them. But as he led them toward his horses, a new fear, colder and sharper than the first, took root in Clara's heart. She had no idea who this man was, and she had no idea what he wanted with her. The dust rose in slow, choking clouds as their horses carried them away from the town. The sound of jeers and whispers faded behind them, becoming just another bad memory. Jonas' heart rode at a steady, unhurried pace. His tall frame seemed to fill the saddle, and he held Elsie in front of him with one strong arm. The little girl's hands clutched the pommel, her cheek pressed against the worn leather. The rhythm of the horse rocked her, but she didn't cry anymore. Silence had taken the place of her sobs, a heavy, watchful silence, as if she was afraid any sound might bring the cruelty of the town rushing back. Clara followed on a weary mare he'd provided. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rope had been. Her whole body ached, not just from the ride, but from the deep, bruising weight of humiliation. Jonas's coat was still wrapped around her shoulders. It smelled of leather and wood smoke, and its weight was both a comfort and a burden. She rode with her back straight, forcing a dignity she didn't feel. Kindness, in her experience, always came with a price. She would not mistake this man's silence for mercy. The trail wound through dry, cracked ground. Mesquite and sagebrush dotted the landscape like scattered bones. The ceaseless, rasping song of cicadas buzzed in the heat. Above them, the sky was a vast, pitiless blue, without a single cloud to offer relief. A hawk circled high overhead, its shadow gliding across the earth below, a silent observer. After an hour, Elsie finally stirred. She tilted her face up to look at Jonas, her voice small and trembling. "Are you going to hurt my mamma?" The words hung in the hot, still air, fragile as glass. Jonas didn't answer right away. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. It held no emotion at all. "No." That was it, just one word. Elsie studied his face, what she could see of it under the brim of his hat. She seemed to find what she was looking for. Her small hands loosened their death grip on the pommel. But she kept glancing back, checking, making sure her mother was still there. Clara met her daughter's eyes and gave a faint nod of reassurance, but her own fear was a knot in her stomach. A promise spoken so easily could be broken just as easily. The hours stretched on. The only sounds were the plodding of hooves, the creak of leather, and the faint jingle of tack. Clara's thoughts spiraled. What was waiting for her at this man's home? What kind of man pays $20 for a ruined woman? Was it pity? Or was it something else, something darker? The fear grew with every mile and with every tightening pang in her belly. The baby was coming soon. What would happen if her time came out here, in the middle of nowhere, with this silent, unreadable stranger? Finally, as the sun began to dip low, Jonas drew their horses to a halt near a dry creek bed. He swung down from his saddle with an easy, unhurried motion and lifted Elsie to the ground. She clung to his leg for a second, then scurried toward a small trickle of water pooled in the shade of a large rock. Jonas knelt and filled a dented canteen. Clara dismounted slowly, painfully. Her knees threatened to buckle, and she had to brace herself against the saddle to keep from falling. She tried to hide her weakness, but she saw Jonas's eyes flicker toward her. He took a half step in her direction, as if to offer help, but then he stopped. He said nothing. He just turned back to the horses. Clara felt the absence of his touch as sharply as if he'd struck her. When dusk began to settle, he built a small fire. Elsie sat nearby, watching him, her childish curiosity finally winning out over her fear. "You always this quiet?" she asked. Jonas looked up from the fire, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Mostly." Clara lowered herself onto a rock, every muscle screaming in protest. Jonas wordlessly offered her a tin cup of water. She hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. A jolt of heat, unexpected and startling, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back quickly and drank in small, careful sips. He gave them dried meat and hard bread. Elsie ate with a desperate hunger. Clara forced herself to swallow a few bites, but her stomach churned with unease. When the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Jonas spread his bedroll on the dirt and lay down without a word. No demands, no threats. He left his coat draped over Clara's shoulders. Elsie curled up against her mother, her small body finally relaxing into a deep sleep. Clara stayed awake for a long time, listening to the distant cries of coyotes. She watched Jonas across the dying fire. His breathing was deep and even. If he meant her harm, he was hiding it well. And that, somehow, was more terrifying than open cruelty. Cruelty was something she understood. This silence, this was an unknown country. In her sleep, Elsie murmured, "He didn't hurt us, Mama." Clara kissed her daughter's hair, her heart aching. Above them, the stars were sharp and cold in the black sky. She didn't know if she'd been rescued or just traded one cage for another. The trail would end soon, and she had a feeling that's when her real test would begin. They reached his ranch as the evening shadows stretched long and thin across the plains. It wasn't much. The fences were weathered but strong. A handful of horses grazed in a far pasture. A modest house with a porch that sagged slightly on one side stood in the center of it all. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from its stone chimney. There was nothing grand about the place, but it had a stillness, a quiet permanence that settled deep in Clara's chest. After the noise and the filth and the hatred of the town, the silence here was deafening. It made her more nervous than the shouting ever had. Jonas dismounted first, his movements as steady and deliberate as always. He lifted Elsie from the saddle. The moment her feet touched the ground, she wiggled free and darted toward a small flock of chickens scratching in the dirt. Her laughter, sudden and bright, bubbled up as if it had been trapped inside her for days. Clara slid from her horse much more slowly, her body stiff and sore. She braced herself against the animal, refusing to show weakness, refusing to ask for help. Jonas led them up the creaking porch steps and pushed open the door. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke, old leather and stale coffee. A rough-hewn table, its surface covered in the scars and marks of hard work, stood in the center of the main room. Shelves lined one wall, crowded with jars of preserves, tools, and neatly stacked tins. Against another wall was a narrow bed, covered with a quilt that had been washed so many times its colors had faded to soft whispers. And in the far corner, half hidden in the shadows, was a cradle. Its wooden rails were polished smooth, as if by hands that had rocked it for years. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. A wave of longing, so fierce and sharp it felt like pain, washed over her. She quickly looked away. Elsie's eyes went wide. "Mama, look," she started to say, but Clara put a hand on her shoulder, silencing her. Hope was a dangerous thing. Clara had learned the hard way that it was a poison that tasted sweet. Jonas left them there without a word. His heavy boot steps faded as he crossed the yard. Through the single dusty window, Clara watched him. He moved with an unbroken rhythm, checking the fence line, carrying a bucket of feed to the horses, scattering grain for the chickens. He worked with the easy, certain motions of a man who had done these same tasks 1,000 times. He never once glanced toward the house. It was as if their presence, her and her daughter, made no difference to him at all. He came back inside after the sun had disappeared completely, leaving the world in shades of grey and purple. He set a loaf of dark bread and a crock of beans on the table. He stepped back, his expression unreadable, his voice flat. "Eat." Elsie didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled onto a chair and tore into the bread with both hands. Clara ate slowly, cautiously. Every bite was a test. Every moment was a question. She watched Jonas over the rim of her water cup. He poured himself a mug of black coffee and stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. His silence wasn't empty. It was a wall. A high, thick wall she couldn't see over. Later, when Elsie was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open, Jonas disappeared into a small back room. Clara tensed, her body going rigid. Dread coiled in her stomach. She slowly rose to her feet, ready to fight, ready to do whatever she had to do to protect her daughter. But when he came back, he was carrying the cradle. He must have been working on it. The joints were tight and solid. The wood had been freshly sanded until it was as smooth as river stone. He set it down on the floor by the bed, and he did it with a surprising care, a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with the hard, silent man she thought he was. Clara stared, her throat suddenly thick. A wave of gratitude, unwanted and confusing, surged through her. She clenched her fists, trying to drive it back down. Every gift she had ever been given had come with strings attached, had come with a price she was forced to pay later. But then Elsie clapped her hands, her sleepy face lighting up. "Mama," she whispered in awe, "it's for the baby." Clara felt hot tears sting her eyes. She turned her face away quickly, before either of them could see. She didn't understand this man. She didn't understand this place, and the not knowing was terrifying. But as she helped Elsie into the narrow bed and pulled the faded quilt over her, she glanced again at the cradle. It sat in the firelight, a silent promise, or maybe a silent threat. She just didn't know which. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. In the mornings, Elsie would follow Jonas out to the chicken coop, her excited chatter filling the quiet yard. She'd carry the eggs back to the house, one by one, cradling them in her small hands as if they were precious jewels. She'd tell Clara stories about the chickens, about the pony Jonas was letting her brush, about the way the sky looked at dawn, and Clara would watch from the porch, her heart torn. It was so peaceful, so simple. And that's what scared her. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Peace, for her, was just the quiet before the storm. The storm came in the form of whispers. The few neighbors who passed by on the dusty road would slow their horses, their eyes lingering on the house, on Clara's swollen belly. Their stares were sharp, their judgments clear even from a distance. When Jonas had to go into town for supplies, he insisted Clara and Elsie come with him. He said it wasn't safe to leave them alone. The town was worse than she remembered. The weight of every stare felt like a physical blow. Women would literally turn their backs as she passed. Men would smirk and whisper things just loud enough for her to hear. Fallen woman, Jonas Hart's charity case, burden, shame. Each word was a stone thrown at her. She would pull her thin shawl tighter around her body and pretend she didn't hear, but the words followed her back to the ranch. They echoed in the silence of the cabin at night. Jonas never spoke of it. He acted as if he didn't see the stares, as if he didn't hear the whispers. But his jaw was always set a little tighter when they came back from town. He spoke little, but his actions had a language of their own. He mended the sagging porch step without being asked. He started leaving a pile of freshly chopped wood by the door every evening. He put a bucket of clean water just inside the door so she wouldn't have to carry it from the well. Small things, quiet things. He never asked about her past. He never asked who the baby's father was. He never spoke of the child at all, except for the cradle he had fixed. His silence was a strange and frightening thing, but it was also the first silence she had ever known that wasn't filled with anger or judgment. One evening, as the sun bled red and orange across the horizon, Clara was sitting on the porch. Jonas sat on the steps nearby, sharpening a knife. The steady, rhythmic rasp of stone against steel was the only sound. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words just came out, her voice thin and brittle in the twilight. "They'll always talk," she murmured, staring out at the darkening plains, "no matter what I do." The sound of the sharpening stopped. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. She thought he would just ignore her, the way he ignored everything else. Then, without looking up from the blade in his hands, he said one thing. "Let them." His tone was flat, unemotional, but the words carried a weight that settled deep in her bones. It wasn't an offer of comfort, it was a statement of fact, a dismissal of the entire world and its opinions. Suddenly, Elsie's laughter erupted from the barn. She came running onto the porch, her hair tangled with straw, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She scrambled into Clara's lap, chattering breathlessly about how the pony had let her put a flower in its mane. Clara held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of hay and sunshine, feeling the small, warm body relax against hers. Jonas set down his knife and the sharpening stone. He lifted his head, and in the dim, fading light, his eyes met hers. His expression was as unreadable as ever. But for the first time, she saw something else in their depths, something fragile, something that looked almost like hope. And in that silent, shared glance, a question hung in the air between them. A question of what this was, what they were becoming. A question that both of them were too afraid to answer. The first pain hit her just after nightfall. It was sharp, a blade twisting low in her belly. Clara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white as a ragged breath tore from her throat. Elsie, who was curled on a rug by the fire with a little straw doll, looked up instantly. Fear bloomed in her wide eyes. "Mama," she whispered. "It's nothing, little bird," Clara gasped, but her voice was strained and thin. Another wave of pain crashed over her, so powerful it bent her double. This time, a cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. Jonas was at her side in an instant. He moved so fast, so silently, it was like he'd materialized out of the shadows. His presence filled the small cabin, all heat and solid strength. "Is it time?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency in it she'd never heard before. Don't, don't touch me," she panted, trying to straighten up. Her pride, stubborn and fierce, flared up even as her body was betraying her. But then her knees buckled. His arms were there to catch her before she hit the floor. She sagged against him, her body trembling uncontrollably, a sob of pain and fear finally breaking free. His strength was like a stone wall, and she realized with a sickening lurch that she could no longer stand on her own. He guided her to the bed, his movements efficient and sure. Elsie scrambled close, her face pale, tears already brimming in her eyes. "Is Mama going to die?" she wailed. "No," Jonas said. The word was firm, absolute. It wasn't a reassurance, it was an oath. The certainty in his voice seemed to calm Elsie. She clung to his leg, her terrified sobs softening. The hours that followed were a blur of firelight and deep shadows, of pain that crested in blinding waves and receded into moments of exhausted dread. Clara's cries filled the small room. She was terrified, not just of the pain, but of dying, of leaving Elsie all alone in a world that had already shown her how cruel it could be. Sweat beaded on her skin, plastering her hair to her face. Her hands clutched the quilt so tightly she thought the fabric would rip. Through it all, Jonas was there. He knelt by the bed, wiping her brow with a cool, damp cloth. He didn't say much, just a few murmured words, spoken low and steady, that became an anchor in the storm of her pain. "Breathe. Hold on. You're not alone." His hand rested on her shoulder. It was large and warm and steady, and its simple weight kept her from spiraling into pure panic. Elsie perched on the edge of the bed, her small face streaked with tears, but glowing with a fierce determination. She clung to her mother's hand. "You can do it, Mama," she whispered over and over again. "The baby's coming. You can do it." It was as if she believed she could keep her mother alive through sheer force of will. And then, after an eternity of agony, a new cry broke the night. It was high and piercing, a raw, powerful wail that cut through the exhaustion and the fear. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, her chest heaving, tears of relief and pain streaming down her face. She was too tired to hide them anymore. Jonas held the newborn first. His large, calloused hands were impossibly gentle as he cleaned the squirming infant and wrapped him in a clean blanket. For a long moment, he just stared down at the tiny, red-faced baby. His expression was still unreadable, but in the firelight, Clara saw a glint in his eyes. It looked like awe. He placed the bundle into Clara's waiting arms. She looked down, and the world outside the small cabin, the town, the whispers, the shame, it all melted away. The baby's tiny fists flailed. His mouth opened in a cry that was pure, unshaped life. She pressed her lips to his damp forehead, her own sobs breaking free. "My child," she whispered. It was a prayer. Elsie leaned in close, her eyes wide with a joy so pure it was breathtaking. "Mama, it's a boy," she said softly. She reached out and gently touched his tiny hand. The baby's fingers instinctively curled around hers. Elsie giggled, a sound of pure delight. "See? He likes me." Clara's gaze lifted from her son's face to Jonas. He was watching them, watching all of them. And the look on his face was one of quiet reverence. Her voice was hoarse, a raw whisper, but she forced the words out. Thank you. It wasn't an admission of debt. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of what he had done for her, for them. Jonas just inclined his head slightly. He said nothing. But his silence, for the first time, felt like a comfort. It was a silence that held respect, a silence that made space for the sacredness of the moment. The cabin grew quiet. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the baby's cries fading to soft hiccups. Elsie curled up on the bed against her mother, her small hand resting protectively on the baby's blanket. Clara held both of her children, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She watched Jonas as he moved around the cabin, tending the fire, setting a kettle of water to warm. He didn't intrude. He didn't claim any part of this. As sleep began to pull her under, a thought drifted through Clara's mind. She had always imagined salvation would come like a thunderclap, a dramatic rescue. She never thought it would arrive so quietly, in the form of a silent man with steady hands, in a silence that sheltered instead of condemned. The story wasn't over, she knew that. The world outside these four walls was still waiting. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt something that felt a little like hope. And she had a feeling that this quiet, broken man was the reason why. But there was one thing she couldn't stop thinking about. The cradle. It was old but cared for. It had been used before. The question was, by who? Jonah's heart had secrets, she was sure of it, and she was living in the middle of them. The next few weeks were a hazy dream of sleepless nights and quiet days. The baby, whom she named Samuel, was small but strong, his cries filling the parts of the cabin that Jonas's silence did not. Clara's body slowly began to heal, but a new kind of weariness settled deep into her bones. It was the weariness of constant vigilance. She watched Jonas. She studied him. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve. He was gentle with the children. He'd let Elsie follow him on his chores, answering her endless questions with short, patient nods. He'd even carved a small wooden horse for her, its lines simple but surprisingly graceful. When the baby cried in the night, he would rise without a word and build up the fire. His presence a steady, unobtrusive shadow in the room. He never offered to hold Samuel, but Clara would often catch him looking at the cradle, a strange, haunted expression on his face. It was an expression of profound loss. One afternoon, while Jonas was out checking the far fences, Clara's curiosity finally got the better of her. She went into the small back room he used for storage. It was neat and orderly, filled with tools, spare tack, and sacks of grain. In the corner, there was a large, dust-covered wooden trunk. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she shouldn't. It was his home, his privacy. But the need to understand, the need to know if she was safe, was a physical hunger. The trunk wasn't locked. She lifted the heavy lid. The air that rose up smelled of dried lavender and cedar. On top was a folded quilt, its pattern a cascade of faded stars. Beneath it were a woman's things. A simple calico dress, neatly folded. A pair of small worn leather boots. A silver-backed hairbrush, with a few long, dark strands of hair still caught in its bristles. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound book. A diary. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The name on the first page was Sarah Hart. His wife. Clara's hands flew to her mouth. She read a few entries, her eyes scanning the pages. It was a diary of a life on the ranch, of planting a garden, of watching the seasons change, of love for a quiet, steady man. And then the entries became filled with joy. Sarah was pregnant. She wrote about her hopes for the child, about the cradle Jonas was building with his own hands. The last entry was dated almost a year ago. "The baby is coming soon," it read. "Jonas worries, but I tell him everything will be fine. Our son will be strong, just like his father. We will be a family." Clara slammed the book shut. A cold dread washed over her. She put everything back exactly as she had found it, closed the trunk, and fled the room. She understood now. The cradle. The haunted look in his eyes. Jonas Hart hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost a child too. This wasn't just his house. It was a tomb, filled with ghosts. And he had brought her and her children, a replacement family, to live in it. The thought was horrifying. His kindness wasn't kindness. It was a desperate attempt to fill a void. She wasn't a person to him. She was a ghost meant to replace another. That evening she couldn't look at him. Every quiet gesture, every steady glance, now seemed sinister. When he added a log to the fire, she flinched. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," she said, her voice tight. He took a step closer. "You're afraid of me again." It wasn't a question. "Shouldn't I be?" She shot back, her fear making her bold. "What am I to you, Jonas? A stray you took pity on? Or something else?" He stared at her, his face a mask of stone. But his eyes were filled with a pain so deep it was like looking into a bottomless well. "I'm not him," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Not who?" "The man who hurt you." Clara's blood ran cold. How could he know? She had never told him. She had never told anyone. "I see it in your eyes," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Every time I get too close, I see him." A new, terrible thought began to form in her mind. It was insane. It was impossible. But the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made her feel sick. His sudden appearance at the auction. The $20. A fortune. The way he'd brought her here, to this specific place, this shrine to a lost family. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just held her gaze, and in the silence, she knew. She didn't know how, but she knew. This wasn't random. None of it was. He knew who had hurt her, and that's when she realized she hadn't been rescued at all. She had been chosen, and she had no idea what for. The revelation changed everything. The air in the small cabin grew thick with unspoken questions. Clara tried to act normal for Elsie's sake, but every moment was charged with a new, terrifying tension. She would watch Jonas move about his chores, his hands steady, his expression unreadable, and wonder what was going on behind those quiet eyes. Was this all for revenge? Was she just a pawn in some game he was playing against the man from her past? The man's name was Thomas Prescott. He was the son of the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a man whose power and influence reached everywhere. He was arrogant, cruel, and used to taking whatever he wanted. Clara had worked as a laundress on his family's ranch. One night he had cornered her, and afterwards, when it became clear she was with child, his family had been the ones to run her out of her small rented room, to brand her a harlot, to make sure she had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. They were the ones who had made sure she ended up on that auction block. It was their way of silencing her, of erasing their son's sin. How did Jonas know him? The answer came a few days later, in a way she never expected. A rider was approaching the ranch. It wasn't a neighbor. This man rode a fine horse, and he sat in his expensive saddle with an air of entitlement. As he got closer, Clara's heart leaped into her throat. It was Thomas Prescott's father, Judge Prescott, the most powerful man in the county. Jonas had seen him coming. He was standing on the porch, his stance relaxed, but his hand was resting near the pistol on his hip. Elsie, sensing the tension, ran to Clara and hid behind her skirts. Judge Prescott reined in his horse a few yards from the porch. He was an imposing man, with a stern, unforgiving face and cold, grey eyes. He ignored Clara completely. His gaze was fixed on Jonas. "Hart," he said, his voice flat and hard, "I heard a rumor you'd bought yourself some damaged goods in town." "I see the rumors were true." Jonas didn't react. "What do you want, Prescott?" "You know what I want," the judge said, his eyes finally flicking to Clara, his expression one of pure disgust. "That thing she's carrying. It's my son's. It's a Prescott. I won't have my grandchild raised in a hovel by a fallen woman and a man like you." "A man like you?" What did that mean? "The boy is not for sale," Jonas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Judge Prescott laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Everything is for sale, Hart. You of all people should know that. I'll give you double what you paid for the woman. $100. You give me the baby, and you and her and the other brat can disappear. I won't have this stain on my family's name." Clara's blood ran cold. He wanted to take her son. He wanted to buy Samuel. "Get off my land," Jonas said. The judge's face hardened. Don't be a fool. You can't win this fight. I own this county. I own the sheriff. I own the law. If you don't give me that child, I'll take him. And I'll see to it that she," he nodded at Clara, "hangs for theft, or trespassing, or whatever charge I feel like inventing. And as for you, well, I'm sure there's still a bounty on your head somewhere." A bounty, the word hung in the air. Jonas wasn't just a rancher, he was a wanted man. "I said," Jonas repeated, and this time his hand closed around the grip of his pistol, "get off my land." Judge Prescott held his gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between the two men. Finally, the judge smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "Have it your way, Hart. But remember this. I always get what I want." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Clara was trembling. She stared at Jonas, her mind reeling. A bounty hunter, an outlaw. Who was he? "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He'll come back with men." "I know," Jonas said, his eyes on the horizon where the judge had disappeared. "He'll take Samuel." Jonas finally turned to look at her. His face was grim, but his eyes held a fire she had never seen before. "Over my dead body," he said. And in that moment, she finally understood. This wasn't about replacing a lost family. It wasn't about pity. It was about justice. Jonas Hart had a history with the Prescotts, a history that was written in blood, and she and her children had just stumbled into the middle of his war. The ranch no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a fortress. And the siege was about to begin. The quiet stillness of the ranch was gone. It was replaced by a heavy, watchful silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Jonas moved with a new purpose. He spent the day reinforcing the doors, boarding up the back window of the cabin, and cleaning his weapons. The pistol on his hip, and a long, heavy rifle he took from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Watching him, Clara felt a strange mix of terror and a new, unfamiliar sense of security. The man she had been afraid of was now the only thing standing between her family and the powerful man who wanted to tear it apart. Elsie could feel the change too. She stayed close to Clara, her usual chatter replaced by wide, worried eyes. That night, no one slept. Jonas sat in a chair by the door, the rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. Clara lay in bed, with Elsie on one side and the cradle with Samuel on the other. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made her heart jump. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked, her voice a whisper in the dark room. Jonas didn't turn around. "The Prescotts owe me a debt." "What kind of debt?" He was silent for a long time. She thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough with old pain. "My wife, Sarah. The doctor in town said she and the baby died of a fever during childbirth. He was a Prescott man. On their payroll. He lied." Clara sat up, clutching the blanket. "It wasn't a fever," Jonas continued, his voice as cold as a grave. "It was poison. A small dose, meant to make her sick, to make her weak. But she was already frail. It killed her. It killed them both." "Poison. Why would anyone—" "Because I knew something," Jonas said. "I used to ride with a rough crowd. I saw Thomas Prescott do something he shouldn't have. He killed a man over a card game. I was the only witness. His father, the judge, offered me money to keep quiet and leave the territory. I took it. I thought I was doing the right thing, starting a new life with Sarah, but the judge didn't trust me. He decided a dead witness was better than a paid one. He sent the doctor to silence me, but I was out on the range that night. He found Sarah alone. The story settled in the room, heavy and suffocating. It explained everything. The ghosts in this house weren't just memories. They were victims. He didn't know she was pregnant," Jonas finished, his voice breaking on the last word. "He just killed her to get to me." Clara felt a wave of sickness and fury. The same family that had ruined her life had destroyed his. They were connected by a shared enemy. "When I heard what they did to you," Jonas said, finally turning to look at her, the firelight catching the glint of unshed tears in his eyes. "When I saw you on that block, carrying his child, I knew I couldn't let them win again. I couldn't let them destroy another family. It wasn't about revenge, not just revenge. It was about redemption. For him. For the family he had lost. The sound came just before dawn, the thud of many horses approaching fast. Jonas was on his feet in an instant. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice sharp. He moved to the door, peering through a small crack. "It's the sheriff," he said, "and a dozen deputies, all on Prescott's payroll." This was it. The judge hadn't even bothered to send his own ranch hands. He had sent the law. A voice boomed from outside. "Jonas Hart, this is Sheriff Miller. You are under arrest for kidnapping. Send out the woman and the children and come out with your hands up." Kidnapping. The charge was absurd, but it was legal. It was the judge's power made real. "They'll kill you," Clara whispered, her heart pounding. "And they'll take the children." "They'll try," Jonas said. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "Keep them safe." He didn't wait for an answer. The first gunshot splintered the wood of the door, and the siege began. The cabin erupted in a chaos of noise, shouting from outside, the thunder of rifles, the shattering of glass as a bullet flew through the main window. Elsie screamed and buried her face in Clara's side. The baby started to wail. Clara scrambled to the floor, pulling Elsie down with her, trying to shield both children with her own body. Through the deafening roar, she could see Jonas. He was no longer a quiet rancher. He was something else entirely. He moved with a deadly grace, firing the rifle through the window, reloading with impossible speed, his face a grim mask of concentration. He was a warrior. He was a man defending his last stand. A bullet tore through the wall just inches from Clara's head, showering them with splinters. She realized with a chilling certainty that they weren't trying to arrest Jonas. They were trying to kill him. They were trying to kill them all. Jonas grunted in pain. He stumbled back from the window, his hand clutching his shoulder. A dark red stain was spreading across his shirt. He was hit. The firing from outside intensified, sensing he was wounded. "It's over," Clara cried, seeing the blood. "Jonas, give up." He looked at her, his jaw set, sweat and blood mixing on his face. "It's not over," he growled, "not while I'm still breathing." But she could see the strength fading from his eyes. He wouldn't last much longer. The judge was going to win. He was going to take her son, and he was going to leave the rest of them dead in the dirt of this cabin. Unless she did something. She looked at her screaming children. She looked at the wounded man who had tried to save them. And she looked at the rifle he'd dropped when he was hit. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her anger was afire. She had been a victim for long enough. She crawled across the floor and picked up the rifle. It was heavy, unfamiliar in her hands, but her choice was simple. She could cower on the floor and wait to die. Or she could fight. She remembered what Jonas had said. Let them talk. She thought of Judge Prescott's cold eyes. "I always get what I want." Not this time, she thought. She took a deep breath, rested the barrel of the rifle on the windowsill, and took aim. Clara had never fired a gun in her life. But desperation was a powerful teacher. She rested the heavy rifle on the windowsill just as she'd seen Jonas do. Outside, the sheriff's men were advancing, using the grey light of dawn for cover. They thought Jonas was down. They thought it was over. They were wrong. She closed one eye, aimed at the shape of a man moving between the barn and the fence line, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force. The explosion was deafening. But she saw the man outside cry out and fall. The other deputies stopped dead in their tracks, stunned. They had been expecting fire from the front of the cabin where Jonas had been. Not from the side window. From his position on the floor, Jonas stared at her, his expression a mix of shock and something else. Respect. Again, he grunted, pressing a hand against his bleeding shoulder. So she did. She reloaded, the movements clumsy and slow, but she did it. She fired again. And again. She wasn't aiming to kill. She was aiming to terrify, to drive them back, to show them that this house was not an easy target. The element of surprise and the ferocity of her defense worked. The deputies, who were just hired guns playing at being lawmen, pulled back. They took cover behind the water trough and the woodpile, unwilling to charge into a second, unexpected rifle. The brief lull gave them a moment to breathe. Clara's ears were ringing, and her shoulder ached fiercely. "They'll try to burn us out," Jonas said, his voice strained. He was struggling to his feet, using a chair for support. "We need to get out of here." "Out where?" Clara cried. "We're surrounded." "There's a root cellar," he said, nodding toward a trapdoor in the floor she had never noticed, hidden beneath a bearskin rug. "It leads to a tunnel. Comes out in the creek bed, 100 yards from the house." It was an escape route. He had planned for this. He had been living with this threat for a long time. "Go," he said, pulling the rug aside and gripping the iron ring on the door. "Take the children. I'll hold them off." "No," Clara said, her voice firm. "We're not leaving you." For the first time since she had met him, Jonah's heart looked truly surprised. He looked at her, at this woman who had been a terrified victim only weeks ago, now holding a rifle with a steady hand, her face smudged with gunpowder and fierce determination. "Clara," he began. "We go together," she said. "Or we don't go at all." Before he could argue, the shouting started again from outside, but this time it was different. It wasn't the sheriff. It was the judge. He must have grown impatient. "Hart," Judge Prescott's voice boomed across the yard. "This has gone on long enough. I have your daughter." Clara's heart stopped. She looked at the spot where Elsie had been huddled. It was empty. In the chaos of the gunfight, the little girl must have slipped away. Terrified, confused, she must have run, right into their hands. "Mama!" Elsie's terrified scream came from near the barn. Jonas swore, a raw, vicious sound. The judge had found their weak spot. "Let the girl go, Prescott," Jonas yelled, his voice ragged with pain and fury. "You know the price." The judge yelled back, "Send out the boy. You have 1 minute, Hart. 1 minute, or the girl pays for your stubbornness." It was an impossible choice. Trade one child for another. Clara looked at Jonas. His face was a mask of agony. He was wounded, bleeding, and now the man who had killed his family was about to kill the child he had sworn to protect. But Clara saw something else in his eyes. He was looking at the rifle in her hands. He was looking at the back door. He was forming a plan, a desperate, insane plan. He met her eyes, a silent question passing between them. A question of trust. She had every reason to hate the world, every reason to trust no one. But in that moment, looking at the man who had bled for her children, she knew what she had to do. She nodded. "I'm coming out," Jonas yelled, staggering toward the front door. "I'm unarmed." "Jonas, no," Clara whispered. "Trust me," he breathed, his eyes locked on hers. "Get ready." He threw open the door and stumbled out onto the porch, his hands raised in surrender, his bloody shirt a clear sign of his defeat. The sheriff and his men emerged from their cover, their guns trained on him. Judge Prescott stood by the barn, holding a terrified, weeping Elsie by the arm. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. He had won. "Wise choice, Hart," the judge sneered. But his eyes were on Jonas. All their eyes were on Jonas. No one was watching the back of the house. Clara moved. She slipped out the back door, keeping low, using the smoke and the shadows as cover. The rifle felt heavy, but her resolve was like steel. She circled around the woodpile, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see them all now. The judge, his men, Jonas on his knees on the porch, and her daughter, her terrified little girl. The judge raised a pistol, pointing it not at Jonas but at Elsie. "Now," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "The boy." That was her signal. Clara rose from behind the woodpile. She was 50 feet away. An impossible shot for a novice, but she wasn't aiming for the judge. She was aiming for the lantern hanging from the corner of the barn, right above a stack of dry hay. She took a deep breath. She remembered Jonas's calm, his focus. She fired. The bullet shattered the lantern. Oil and flame rained down on the hay. It went up in an instant, a whoosh of fire and smoke. For a split second, everyone was stunned. The deputies turned toward the fire. The judge, startled, loosened his grip on Elsie. It was the only chance they would get. "Now!" Jonas roared. He launched himself off the porch, not at the sheriff, but at the deputies closest to him. Even wounded, his attack was a blur of savage force. He was a cornered wolf, fighting with his last breath. At the same time, Elsie, seeing the fire and hearing Jonas's shout, did what any terrified child would do. She bit the judge's hand hard. He yelled in pain and surprise, shoving her away. Elsie scrambled away from him, running, not toward the house, but toward the only other person she trusted. She ran toward the fire. She ran toward her mother. Clara scooped her up without breaking stride, turning back toward the chaos. The barn was now fully engulfed in flames. The deputies were in disarray, caught between the fire and the wounded man who was fighting like a demon. Jonas had bought them time. He was on the ground now, wrestling with two men, but he was fading fast. Clara saw the sheriff recover from the shock. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim at the back of Jonas's head. There was no time to think. Clara shoved Elsie behind her. "Stay here," she commanded. She raised her own rifle. She and the sheriff were aiming at the same time, but he was aiming at an easy target. She was aiming at a man who was already turning toward her. She fired a heartbeat before he did. Her bullet struck him in the chest. His shot went wide, splintering the porch rail next to Jonas's head. The other deputies froze, looking from their fallen leader to the woman standing by the burning barn, a smoking rifle in her hands. In that moment of hesitation, everything changed. From the smoldering ruin of the barn, Judge Prescott emerged, his face black with soot and contorted with rage. He had lost his prize. He had lost control. All he had left was hate. He raised his pistol and fired at the closest target. Not Jonas, not Clara. He fired at Elsie, but Jonas, with the last of his strength, threw his body in front of the child. The bullet slammed into his back. He collapsed with a groan, a shield over the little girl he had sworn to protect. Clara screamed, a sound of pure rage and grief. She raised the rifle one last time. She and the judge stood alone now, separated by a field of chaos and bodies. He was a powerful man, a judge, the law. She was a ruined woman, a nobody. But in her hands she held the great equalizer. She didn't hesitate. Her shot was true. Judge Prescott fell, the surprise still etched on his cold, dead face. Silence descended on the ranch, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Elsie's terrified sobs. Clara ran to Jonas. He was lying face down in the dirt, still covering her daughter. She gently rolled him over. His eyes were open, but they were glassy. There was too much blood. "Jonas," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He looked at her. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Sarah," he breathed. And then his eyes closed. Clara knelt there in the dirt, clutching her daughter, the smoking rifle at her side. The surviving deputies had fled. The fire was burning itself out. The battle was over. She had won. She had saved her children, but she had lost the only man who had ever shown her what it meant to be truly saved. Clara knelt in the dust for a long time, the warmth of the rising sun doing little to chase away the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Elsie's sobs slowly quieted, replaced by the exhausted, hiccuping breaths of a child who had seen too much. Samuel, miraculously, had slept through the end of the gunfight, and his cries from inside the cabin finally broke the spell. She had to move. She had to survive. For them. With an aching heart, she checked Jonas again. His breathing was shallow, a faint flutter in his chest, but he was alive. Barely. The next few hours were a desperate struggle. She managed to drag Jonas, an almost impossible weight, back inside the cabin. She tore strips from her cleanest petticoat to bind his wounds, one in his shoulder, the other, far worse, in his back. She cleaned them as best she could with whiskey from a bottle in his cupboard, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pour it. He was unconscious, lost in a fevered haze. Days bled into one another. Clara did not sleep. She tended to Jonas, cooling his fevered skin with damp rags. She cared for her children, her movements automatic, her mind a numb fog of grief and fear. She milked the cow, fed the chickens, and kept the fire going, her world shrinking to the four walls of that cabin. Every breath Jonas took was a victory. Every time his fever seemed to break, only to return stronger, was a fresh torment. On the fifth day, he woke up. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time they were clear. He looked at her, his gaze weak but lucid. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Tears of relief streamed down her face. "Jonas." He looked around the cabin, at Elsie playing quietly on the floor, at Samuel sleeping in his cradle. You saved us," he said. "We saved each other," she answered softly. His recovery was slow, agonizingly slow, but with every passing day, a little more strength returned to him. As he healed, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer a wall of secrets and pain. It became a space of shared understanding, of comfort. They would sit for hours without speaking, but the silence was full of everything they had been through together. One afternoon, as he was sitting in a chair on the porch, watching Elsie chase butterflies, he finally spoke of the future. The deputies who ran, "They'll tell a story," he said. "They'll say the judge went mad. They'll cover their own tracks. No one will come looking for trouble here." "So we're safe?" Clara asked. "For now," he said. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "This ranch, Sarah's memory, it's a good place, but it's filled with ghosts. It's no place to raise a family." Clara's heart sank. She thought he was telling her to leave. "The land is worth something," he continued, "enough to start over, somewhere new, somewhere no one knows our names." He paused, and the next words he spoke were quiet, hesitant, as if he was afraid of the answer. If, if that's what you want." He wasn't telling her to leave. He was asking her to stay. With him. She looked at her children. Elsie, laughing in the sunshine. Samuel cooing in his cradle just inside the door. She looked at this quiet, broken man who had fought for them, who had nearly died for them. He was scarred, just as she was. They were two broken people who together somehow felt whole. She had come to this place as a prisoner, a piece of property. But she had found something she never thought she would have again. A home, a partner, a chance. "There's just one thing," she said, a small smile playing on her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "What's that?" he asked. "If we're going to be a family," she said, her voice growing stronger, more certain, "I think you're going to have to learn to talk a little more." A slow smile spread across Jonas Hart's face, transforming his rugged features, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. "I think," he said, his voice full of a promise she knew he would keep, "I can do that." The sun was warm on their faces. The sound of their daughter's laughter filled the air. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more hardships, more challenges. But for the first time, Clara Mayfield wasn't afraid. She was home. What did you think of Clara's journey? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption.